You're listening to In Network, Nordic's podcast series where we explore healthcare and technology with experts from around the globe.
Hello, and welcome to the In Network podcast feature, Designing for Health. I'm Nordic's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Craig Joseph.
And I'm Nordic's Head of Thought Leadership, Dr. Jerome Pagani. We recently sat down with Dr. Manish Patel, CEO and co-founder of Jiva AI.
Manny shares with us the difficulties of representing highly technical information to quote-unquote normal people, describes how to design at different levels of a given system, and explains why he often prefers apps like Canva rather than apps like Photoshop.
He also tells us about the different approaches to developing AIs, making AI not only understandable but trustworthy, and illustrates what shortcomings in the healthcare industry might be addressed by AI in the future. Let's plug in.
Dr. Manish Patel, welcome to the podcast.
Many thanks.
How are you doing this fine evening?
This fine afternoon in London, it's not too bad. Not too sunny, but it's okay.
I was under the impression you were 27 hours behind us here in the United States. Is that
completely possible?
Or ahead? I'm not sure it actually matters when we get to that number. Well, let me begin by asking you a question. And since we've now established that you do not live in the United States, I am going to try to translate this question into English for you.
Yeah, go on.
So I understand that ever since you were in reception, that's the pregnant pause, which I think is what we call kindergarten.
Yes. Very good.
Ever since you were in reception, you've wanted to be involved with AI startups, and that you were talking to your teachers back then about artificial intelligence. Is that accurate?
100% true.
Okay.
Back in 1981. Yeah.
So in 1981, you were telling your teacher that you were going to co-found an AI-based company. And did you say that you were going to get a PhD as well? Was that also predicted?
No, the truth is there's only one reason I did a PhD. When I finished my master's, my mum said I had to get married. I'm an Indian, right? Indian origin. My mum said I had to get married. And the only thing I could think of that would prevent her from pursuing is to say, I can't, I'm still studying. And so I did a PhD.
Dr. Pagani, is that the normal route?
I have heard the matrimony or matriculation before. Yeah, yep, that checks out.
Excellent. Well, why don't you tell us the whole complete story of how you became the co-founder of Jiva?
Sure. So I was never that much of an academic, actually. I wasn't talking about AI in 1981. I was actually crying my eyes out because I always wanted to come home when I was in kindergarten, or reception, as we say here. So I started off, well, as I say, as a bit of a non-academic, kind of went into university as a molecular geneticist around the time when the Human Genome Project was finishing. So maths and computing was coming into biology in a really big way. And that's how I got introduced to machine learning back in 2000, 2001. Did my master's, as I say, my PhD in that particular subject, and built the fundamental basis of what we have at Jiva at the moment. Very quickly found I can't afford a house in London as a postdoc. So I gave up being an academic and sold my soul to the devil and worked for banks and hedge funds in the algorithmic trading space, as everyone does. I was actually at Lehman Brothers. I was at Lehman Brothers when it was peak share price, the day, and then it started falling. And then I was there when it collapsed, which was fun. Ended up doing a couple of hedge funds, banks, and then, then got back into healthcare, advising tech startups, health tech startups in particular, and then started Jiva in 2019.
Well, that's great. I think, as you say, everyone has gone and worked for Lehman Brothers.
Absolutely, everyone.
I know certainly I have, and Jerome has. So that's basically how you kind of came to Jiva. What did you see as a need to start Jiva.ai?
So we started Jiva in 2019, along with two other co-founders, Chetan and Sarah. Now, Chetan is a doctor. He's a clinician, owns a couple of private practices in London, very successful. He, at one point, asked me to do some analysis of data, and I gave him a two double-barreled kind of word that I'm not allowed to say on this podcast because I didn't have the time. right? But therein actually lies the problem. There are absolutely tons of clinicians, healthcare professionals, people related within healthcare and life sciences who are experts in their field, but don't have a clue how to do AI and machine learning or data science, or don't even know how to string a piece of code together. Why would they? That's not their expertise. They don't need to. So what we wanted to do was create a system where people like yourselves, who might not be coders yourselves, but you'll be able to describe your problem in natural language on our platform and describe what you want to do. And the system takes you through step by step in creating that solution with you. So you remain the expert in whatever you do. Say you're a pediatrician and you're trying to diagnose the onset of a collapsed lung in a premature baby or something. And you don't know how to interpret the signals from all the machines and write some code that might be able to predict such a thing. But you could actually tell our system, well, this is what I want to do. These are the types of data that I have. How would I go about analyzing that data? And we can take you through step by step, node by node, how to actually do that. So in that equation, you remain the expert in your field. We remain the experts in AI and machine learning, and together we create something amazing.
That's great. I'm glad you've done it. When we were preparing for this episode, you had mentioned that one of the more difficult parts of this endeavor for you, pretty much with any software company actually, is that the software company is filled with technical people who don't understand how normal people think. And you have to represent some very technical things sometimes to quote unquote a normal person. And to me, that sounds like design. And that's one of the things that we like to focus on here is design and its overlap with healthcare. So how do you do that? How do you get a bunch of PhD type people like yourselves to be able to translate the needs of the common person?
So there's millions of clever people out there, but actually relatively few have the tools, so the mental tools, to be able to articulate something that's incredibly complicated in the expert field that they're in words that a 7-year-old can understand. And I know you have about the mental age of a 7-year-old, so I'll try to dumb it down for you as I speak about AI. So this is a really difficult skill to learn. It is really hard, but actually anyone can do it so long as you understand what you're actually talking about. That's the main thing, is you firstly understand the complexity of your own world, whatever it might be, say it's quantum physics or AI or whatever it might be, and you're able to articulate that and string it together in a way that someone in everyday circumstances can relate to. So when I explained AI to my son, he was 10 years old at the time, I explained it in a way that he understood from school. He goes to school, he learns, his brain is able to pick up signals from his teacher, and that's how he trains his brain to remember things. And actually, AI is not that different from that. It's just more artificial. It runs inside a computer. The brain is the CPU and the memory combined. So putting it in that particular way is a skill that I think is learned. I don't think you're born with it or anything. It's just a matter of understanding how to do it. Now, finding those people who already have it is actually hard because there's not that many of them, but easy in that when you do spot it in a potential employee, you get it straight away. So some of our employees will attest to the fact that we, in our interview process, we'll go through a set of questions like, how would you write a piece of code that does X? And some of them really struggle, and some of them just say, well, we just do this, and this, and this, and explain it really, really simply. And the guys that can do it simply are the ones that actually understand what they're talking about. The ones that waffle and talk a bit too much, maybe they're nervous, so I'll be being a bit unkind. But the ones that talk a little bit too much are probably trying to pad a little bit of blank space in the interview to get to a certain point. So simplicity, I think, is actually the key there. Making things simple. Like I say, it's a tough art to master. On that note, do you remember how simple the first version of Android was? I don't know if you're an Android user or an Apple user, but one of the first versions of Android was absolutely rubbish. It looked like a really rubbish version of Genome, which people who use Linux will remember. Horrible interface. I mean, why would you ever use it? It was simple, but it was highly unintuitive. So actually, simplicity, whilst that is the key, it has to be kind of tuned into intuition. How does a human actually interact with something in an intuitive way? And that's pretty fundamental actually to what we do at Jiva in making AI easy for everyone to access.
Well, so some groups might give you a counterpoint and say, well, it's okay to have the developer be super techie and not think like a human, as long as I have a designer who kind of can sit between them and the code that they produce, might achieve the same effect. Have you gone along those lines, or do you just say, no, we're going to look for the person who gets it, so I don't need to have that intermediary?
So I've been on both sides of the fence here. So I was a deep technical person, and as the CTO of another company I was at, built what I thought was something that was awesome. It was a messaging system for doctors and patients to share data securely, and for that data to make its way up to the EMR system, and all those kind of things. And I thought it was great, and then we showed it to a couple of nurses and showed it to a couple of patients, and they were just scratching their heads, thinking, "How do we don't get it? How do we get to this point or that point?" And at that point, we actually got a UX developer involved. He kind of did his bit of research, and he said, "Well, why do we just make it simpler like this or this?" So, and I've seen that work. I've seen having a designer or a UX person in between to translate between the people who are using the application to the people who are actually developing the application, and make that thing easier to use. It doesn't always work, I've got to say. So that hasn't. I've been in a couple of situations where that's just been an absolute disaster. Maybe we just had the wrong designers, I suppose. But I think in general, if you have someone that understands the user and knows what makes the user happy, right? What does happy equate to? Ease of use, get to do the things that they want to do quickly without clicking 3 million times on 20 different buttons. Then if you can get to that point, then great. You should definitely put a designer in place to translate to developers. Developers, their brains are wired completely differently, right? They're very logical people. That I'll talk to my wife. She's an actuary. She likes complexity in the things that she does on her spreadsheets. She would never be able to develop something that's easy for anyone to use. She can't even explain her job.
Manny, is part of the problem that the developer and the end user are conceptualizing the problem differently in your experience? Or is it that they are focused on a different end state? And what is the role of design there, really? Where do you get sort of the most bang for your buck?
Yeah, so there's probably 2 or 3 different things happening there that's actually outside of the developer and the designer and the user. And actually, as always, it's probably something to do with management. So management have some idea of what they want to do. They tell developers what they want. Developers interpret that in their own way. There might be some kind of exchange about, what is acceptable, what is our acceptance criteria for this particular project. Acceptance criteria tend to be very stepwise, very logical, don't tend to imbibe a sense of intuition in the application creation process. And then we're surprised we find things that are very kind of computerized. I can't really think of the word. You know what I mean? Kind of jagged edge rather than soft edged type of user interface. And so I think the fundamental thing is in that communication between manager and developer, the designer has to be there right in the middle. So don't exclude the designer from that entire process. And I understand, like for us, I say from experience, we didn't do that to begin with because we couldn't afford it. We were a startup, we were bootstrapped, right? So we didn't do it. But eventually put that designer in place in between so that whatever the manager thinks or the managers think should be the solution, that is actually passing through a filter where the designer or the UX person has actually gone out to market. They've actually gone to ask the users and interviewed them about what they think is important, and imbibe that into the application. That's all well and good in theory. I'll go a bit further, which is a little bit sort of off-piste, but in startup world, the companies that have done really, really well, the unicorns, have often thought of things that the user didn't even know they wanted. That becomes really difficult then, because actually you don't have someone to go out to market. Steve Jobs never went out to market and said, "Oh, what would you like in your all-in-one iPod, phone, web browser?" Obviously, they might have done things in sporadically, but they were visionaries, right? They created a visionary product, but they understood simplicity, and they understood making things intuitive, and that's why that thing was so successful. No one actually really needed it, if you think about it. We only needed it after we knew we needed it.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. So just to summarize what I heard, management is the problem.
I can say that I'm the CEO.
And if you get rid of management, everything will flow quite nicely. I like that, and that's one of the key things. Is how can we all become Steve Jobs? We can't, right? But oftentimes, your users might tell you that they want something, but it's different than what they need, and they don't take into account how others might be needing something as well, right? So, if you ask a nurse in the intensive care unit what they need, you might get very different answers than a nurse in the emergency department or a nurse that works in an outpatient clinic. So that's another aspect I suspect that you have to take into consideration. You ask the question, but then you might have to ignore the answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's no right way of filtering that complexity out. You're always going to get noise, right? You're never going to get 100 people saying the same thing. Entirely different scenario here. I've gone through the startup journey. As part of that startup journey, I have to create a pitch deck, usually 12 to 14 pages of what the company is and does and where we want to go. And I can guarantee I can ask 100 different investors and advisors on feedback on the deck, and I will get 100 different responses, because those kind of things are highly subjective, right? So you've got to somehow rise above the noise and just say, okay, on average, what do people need right now? Actually, the true visionaries ask, what do those guys need tomorrow? Because those are the ones that are going to do really, really well. Right? And that's a very difficult thing to translate into design, because you can't actually ask anyone and validate it. You have to imagine it.
Right. And that's great. And it's a great segue into another question, comparing two pieces of software. And I think you would mention this before, Canva and Photoshop. And those are probably words that most of our listeners did not expect to hear us discussing on our Designing for Health podcast. But so those are two different pieces of software with kind of two different visions and two different user bases. And I'd love for you to kind of compare and contrast the two about how you use them and how you see them being, fitting into our world.
Absolutely. So the very first time I used an Adobe product was in 2001 or two. I can't remember what I was doing. I was doing some graphicsy type of thing for the department. The university department was that. I was completely blown away by how complex that application was, even back then. I look at it now. I look at things like Illustrator, and I'm sure there's obviously people out there that use it and with great effect, right? Because it's got so much functionality in there. But for a newcomer, entirely untrained, it's really difficult to approach that. Now, they are two products, as you say, that are aimed at two different types of people. The people that really know what they're doing in design and have probably been trained to use those kind of things. And then Canva for the more general populace. But when you think about it, I mean, I know designers who actually use Canva to do quick mockups. Why? Because it's really fast. It's really easy to use, right? And the more easy you make something to use, the more popular it's going to be. So if your objective is, number of users, uptake, possibly revenue associated with that and popularity, then ease of use is the way to go. Of course, there's always going to be, requirements to go the more complex route where you have to cater to a more complex audience. But that's going to be a relatively small population compared to the massive one over there. Canva versus Illustrator, or all these other products that Adobe have that I have no idea what the difference is between them all. That's kind of the same thing that we're trying to do in Jiva, right? Most of the applications out there are like the Adobe type applications. They're really hard to use, really difficult to put together an AI data science solution for a newcomer, for someone who's not untrained. We're trying to make Jiva like a Canva. You come to it, you don't need to be trained. You just basically start experimenting, click and dragging, and you'll get to a point where you can actually create something that's really amazing. ChatGPT done exactly the same thing. What did they do? They didn't add loads of buttons. They didn't add loads of drop downs to say, yeah, let's see. There's lots of different ways you can actually change GPT, temperature and things like this. They didn't expose any of that. It was literally text box, put your language in there, and your history on the left-hand side. That's it. How many users do they have now? 100 million?
Manny, that is a great point, and ties into something that we've written about in the book, which is that you have to design for different levels of the system. So some things end up being designed on a project level, but then they don't scale within the organization, or they end up being designed for the organization as a whole, but they don't help that organization fit into the larger health ecosystem. So similar to the Canva Adobe problem. And in consulting, we talk about this as not trying to boil the ocean, right? Yeah. So how do you pick the level of analysis or level of design that you want to aim for to make it maximally useful, not just for sort of the individual stakeholders that you're able to get around the table at that particular point in time, but as you said, as a visionary does, they're really designing for a larger group and for a bigger purpose than just what's sitting on the table in front of them.
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's a really difficult one to answer generically, but let's start here. So to get to a point where you're addressing the audience that you're targeting first, you actually need to understand what that target actually is, right? So the very first step is, who is my user? Who is my customer? Try to understand who they are. Forget about how big that population is. Adobe didn't care that their applications would have only appealed to 0.00001% of the population. It was that part of the population that they really wanted to wow, and they've completely, monopolized that part of the market for those types of users, for graphic designers and things like this. So understand who you're actually trying to target, and don't worry about the magnitude of that target. Ask them what they want to do. Ask them what they feel is necessary. Don't necessarily take that as gospel, because sometimes they are not visionaries. They can tell you what they want right now, like you were saying, but they can't tell you what they want tomorrow because they can't see it yet until you show them. So there is a mix of your own imagination, your own creativity in that whole conversation, which comes up with something that no AI could ever come up, at least at the moment. No AI can come up with a design, an idea that formulates in your mind that no one else thought of before, and you test it, and you'll probably do that about a gazillion times before you get it right. But that's just the name of the game.
So let's change gears a little bit and talk about AI and what it looks like today and sort of how it's going to evolve. So the way that AI models are built today are largely, they're clearly defined languages and sort of structures for the models that we build today. But we can easily see this beginning to shift into sort of a low code, no code kind of AI development. What does that look like? And how will that sort of change the way AI is built and deployed in the future?
Sure. So rewind 20 years. Do you remember around the .com peak where all these big companies were hiring HTML developers?
Yeah.
Do you want to search for HTML developer in LinkedIn and see how many results come up? Probably not.
Got to be almost nothing.
Right? Disappeared. Why? Because people like companies like WordPress or Wix and all these different types of companies, they highly commoditize access to HTML development through a no-code interface. Right? They made it easier, which actually meant the people that were doing HTML coding before and maybe even made a career out of it had to switch to CSS or design or something more related that wasn't covered by that kind of application. So I see the same thing happening with AI. We're flush with data scientists and AI engineers, a lot of people say that data scientists are actually not data scientists, but you know what I mean. There's lots of those type of people And I think they're going to find in the next few years, actually, only the guys that are, I say guys in a non-gender sense, by the way, the guys that are really deep coders, the guys that do the nitty-gritty of AI machine learning at a very low level, I think only those guys will survive. And the rest of them, the fat will just be skimmed off and they'll move on to something else. Because there'll be applications like Jiva who can highly commoditize the access to AI solutions without you having to write any code at all. It's what happens with almost every technology. At some point, there's going to be lots of people who are absolute geniuses at doing these things. But then it very quickly disappears because someone else comes along and says, well, actually, you don't need to do that. You can just do it like this. Made it easier. As human beings, I mean, we're pretty lazy people when you think about it. We always take the easiest route, right? We never learn anything. At school, we're told, yeah, choose the harder path. You'll learn more. But no, that hardly ever happens. Everyone takes the easier road because it's easier, and that always wins.
So, Manny, you deal with healthcare mostly or exclusively. Let me ask that actually. Which is it? Answer the question.
Mostly healthcare. Yeah.
All right. And so being at the forefront of AI in healthcare, any predictions from you about where you see healthcare going with reference to AI? We've established that all developers are going to be out of jobs in a couple of years. I think you just said that. What about physicians? When do I have to have my retirement set if I'm a radiologist or a pathologist?
Oh, I don't think you need to worry about that. So I think healthcare is going to be you're not going to have to worry about that due to AI, and there might be other things, I suppose. But at least with respect to AI, I think in healthcare we'll have the highest amount of excitement and hype, but probably one of the lowest uptakes in industry. And the reasons for that is actually they're actually very sound. Firstly, I don't know of any AI company in healthcare or any health tech company that is using AI in healthcare that is touting the replacement of clinicians in any shape or form. If anything, it's an empowerment mechanism. So almost everyone, I mean, I'm going to say almost everyone, only because I can't think of anyone, but I'm sure there might be one or two. Everyone is talking about having a human in the loop, whatever it might be. So at Jiva, we've created a prostate cancer diagnostic. The idea being that we want to reduce the number of biopsies that get done after MRI scanning. And that is all about making the radiologist more accurate in predicting whether or not there is a clinically relevant tumor in the scan. Now, at no point are we saying replace the radiologist with the AI. What we're saying is use this as a tool in much the same way you use a DICOM viewer or an EMR system rather than paper to make yourself more efficient, get through more of them, do them more accurately for the benefit of the patient. That's essentially where all of this is going. Absolutely no one, as far as I know, is talking about replacing clinicians in any shape or form. Making healthcare systems more efficient is actually, I guess it means something different in the US as it does in the UK, given that we have a national health service. But at least with the national health service, which is basically keeling over at the moment for a number of reasons, there could not be a stronger argument to augment the current healthcare system with automation and AI supervised with humans, so we can mitigate the risk as much as possible, so that they can be more efficient, so they can get through more patients, so they can get through the backlogs and get it back on its feet again. That's really, really important. We're not talking about there's a similar argument going on in the UK. There've recently been rail strikes as well as nursing strikes. And with the rail strikes, it's a bit different. They're talking about having automation in trains to drive them without effectively a driver. But actually, no one is saying you shouldn't have a fully qualified driver on standby on the train just in case they need to do something. They're just saying, actually, let's just make that more efficient. Because drivers get distracted sometimes, that kind of thing, right? That's okay. I think that's okay. So long as they're not saying replace an entire workforce. And just to clarify, I wasn't before when I was talking about data scientists and machine learning engineers, I wasn't talking about getting rid of an entire workforce. I was just saying they're just going to get displaced and do something else, just like everyone else did. Right? Even in the Industrial Revolution, people moved on to something else. The guys that were working on doing manual work, they ended up learning how to use machines. So humans move on. They move on to do other things. So we're not talking about replacing anyone. So long as we have that mindset, I think in the next 10 years, to answer your question directly, so long as we have that mindset, we'll see AI being adopted in good volume. I'm not going to say across the spectrum, but in good volume. And I'm afraid to say some of that is because some of the older generation is going out and some of the skepticism is going out and the new generation is coming in. But a lot of that is also because the technology is getting that good. Regulations are kind of catching up in some countries. And people understand that, okay, if you're going to use an AI as a diagnostic, as an example, that's got to be properly clinically validated. If you're going to use an AI to predict bed occupancy, okay, that's not very highly regulated. There shouldn't be many barriers to entry to that particular type of scenario.
So, Manny, you said, and I think very rightly, that it's not just the AI that is important, it's the way that, like all technologies, people interact with it. Today, that's very manual, keyboard and mouse, but that's going to change. So what is that going to look like in the near to intermediate term future? And how is that going to influence uptake and usage within healthcare?
Yeah, so for taking a step back away from healthcare just for a second, I think the interactivity with machines, our human to machine interfaces, is just going to change forever in the next 10 years. We're so used to using the keyboard and mouse. We only just started using voice 5 or 6 years ago in any big way, right? I think those things are just going to, I mean, I saw some really amazing stuff just the other day on LinkedIn where someone had quickly, sort of very generically, put together some code that could read some ECG, not ECG, sorry, brain information, what are they called? Waves of some kind.
EEG.
EEG, yeah. And he was able to get words onto the screen by thinking about certain things. I mean, how cool is that? Elon Musk is working on something similar. No idea how far they've got. Neuralink, I think it's called. Those things, those interfaces are going to change. That's the first thing. Within healthcare, the one interface that is never going to change is human doctor or nurse or healthcare professional with a human patient. That's always going to be there, no matter how much technology you have. Maybe up until the point we have Star Wars-like type of, doctors delivering babies who are actually droids, that type of stuff. We're obviously many years away from that. But that part is never going to change. So AI, in whatever shape or form it takes, in whatever sub-profession within healthcare it finds itself in, is always going to be an augmentation tool. It's going to be something that either sits in the background and tells the healthcare professionals as to, upcoming risks maybe or diagnoses, or it's going to be something that is going to hit screening. That screening is a big thing here in the UK as well. Can we actually select patients that are susceptible to certain diseases before it actually happens and therefore not cost the healthcare system further down the line? That's very important in countries where there is a system that is paid for by the state. Right. So those two areas I think are the main drivers, main uptake people.
So, Manny, when I was an undergrad, there were two courses that were super popular. One of them was called Rocks for Jocks, and the other was Physics for Poets. And the whole idea was to take those really complex ideas that are very important, but boil them down to something that a very non-technical audience could understand and make use of. And it seems like Jiva AI does that, but actually goes beyond that. So you're not just talking about putting concepts in people's hands. You're creating tools that help everyday people in healthcare do things in a new way and extend their functionality. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I said a little bit beforehand that it's important that we put an application in Jiva, essentially, in front of users where we have a clear separation of what the expertise is of the user and what the expertise is of Jiva. So you guys are doctors. You guys have a specialty. You know what you're doing in your clinical environments. Jiva does not know this, and it doesn't have to. Right? You guys remain the experts in that particular field. But you don't know how to do data science and AI, and that's where Jiva comes in. And so that interface is really important, that we make the complexity of data science really easy for you to access, to the point where you can just interact with it with natural language. You can describe what you want, and the system starts creating the solution with you. But it's really important as you're going through those steps that Jiva explains back to you why certain things are being done. Right? So as an example, you could create a model, in general, artificial neural networks are very, what we call black box models. very difficult for you to understand what's actually going on under the hood. Now, we might understand kind of what's going on under the hood and how we built it, but you certainly don't. What we would try to do in that particular circumstance is try to make it a little bit more grey box, a little bit more white box. So we try to tell the clinician, okay, this model predicted that this was a cancer, and these are the reasons why. These are the inputs that you gave us, and these things we think are really high indicators of whatever it is, the type of cancer you're trying to predict, because we've seen this in history. And wouldn't it be cool if our model could also say, well, out of the thousands of training data sets that you gave me to train on, I can pick these 10 and look how similar they are to your test data set, to your test patient. And because they're so similar, and these were all cancer, we think this guy's cancer. And so having that explainability, that white boxing is really important. That's kind of in the enriched model sense. But also when you're actually interacting with Jiva and trying to build a model, we want this kind of to be like Excel, right? So in Excel, you don't know how you might know, but you don't know how a t-test is coded under the hood in VB or whatever it is in Excel. You don't know how the spreadsheet works when you're doing a VLOOKUP or an HLOOKUP and all these kind of amazing functions. Excel just makes it magically easy. Stick the formula in and it just works most of the time. It's a funny story about that, actually, about Excel, which I'll tell you about later. But usually it just works. So we want to make Jiva like this, that the technical magic that actually really doesn't matter is hidden away. We expose the simplicity, but where it matters, where it's actually really important to tell the clinician why certain things are happening and how they're happening, that's the things that we expose. So not the, how do I explain this as an analogy? If you have a glass of water, you don't need to understand the quantum mechanics of the protons and neutrons and oxygen and hydrogen atoms, the perfect positioning of everything. Even if you could, you just need to know it's a glass of water.
I love that. And if you could explain to me why the water molecules bent, that would be great.
There's a whole journal.
Because apparently that's important, Manny, that H2O is bent.
I guess you're talking about, I don't know. But I do know there is a whole journal dedicated to the chemical properties of water, which I found at King's College when I was there, which I found very interesting.
Well, we'll have to find a link to that because I know our listeners really want to understand molecular biology.
It's pretty fundamental, I would say, yeah. Yeah.
What is the story of Excel? That you said there was a humorous story of Excel, and I believe I have heard zero humorous stories of Excel.
I say, well, humorous, but maybe it's not so humorous. So when I was doing my PhD at UCL, I was in the oncology department for part of my time there, and one of the medical physicists was building his dosimetry model. So dosimetry being, how you figure out how much radiology to give to a patient for a particular cancer in Excel. And what he found actually was, because it was quite a complex set of equations, what he found was that Excel was introducing a tiny decimal error for every calculation, and it was adding up as it was going along. And actually that caused it to be quite dramatically wrong towards the end. He recoded everything in R as we did back in the day, and so it was completely different. So those things do kind of happen when you hide away complexity, but I guess that's more to do with testing your technical capability more than anything else. I say that's it's not actually that funny. I'm kind of hoping no one died from that.
Well, I was going to laugh until you said that last part. So I'm
sure no one did. I'm sure no one did. They were all terminal. Don't worry about it.
Wow, Manny, you're really taking this to a dark place. All right. Well, let's talk about something a little bit more with a happier ending. You had a daughter who was born several months premature and found yourself, along with her, in the neonatal intensive care unit at the hospital. And one of the things that you've mentioned in the past is that you heard a lot of beeping noises. And sometimes the what nurses did in response to those beeping noises was a little upsetting. So yeah, tell us that story and what were the takeaways for you?
the whole birth of my daughter is a very long story. I won't take you through that one, but it was a bit of a traumatic experience, obviously, for both me and my wife. Her being born 3 months early, being this tiny little thing, kind of looked like this. You know how birds, like baby birds, fall out of a nest and they're kind of like this with their hands out. That's what's kind of what she looked like. But what was actually really distressing, at least for new parents, is you see all these kids I can't remember if it was NICU or SCABU, I can't remember the difference. But anyway, in this department, you have these 6 or 7 kids in each ward in the incubator, and this is bleeping sounds, really loud. Everything's like bleeping, and you got all these machines connected up to the incubator and connected up to my daughter, and the chest and the oximeter and all that kind of stuff. Everything's beeping. Even when her oxygen levels they kept on dipping below 80%, right? And we're told that was really bad. We had no idea what was good or bad. It was still orange on the screen, so I thought orange is not as bad as red, so it's not too bad. But actually, 80 is bad. So, but all they do is just press the button, silence it. I just kept on silencing these alarms. And what's the point of setting an alarm? At a certain point, it goes below 70, 75 or whatever it is. I can't remember what the threshold was. And it just alarms for no intelligent reason. What if you were temporarily below the threshold and came back up again? Right? Is that an alarm? Is that a positive signal? And there's a lot of data science there. There's 2 things. There's a lot of data science, signal processing there. But there's also a lot of design flaw there, I think, that what happens when there's actually something that's really important? Something's alarming, and these nurses, they do a great job, absolutely fantastic job, but they get tired. They're humans, and at some point they're just going to on autopilot. They're just going to switch something off without realizing it's actually important. And that's what really scared me, is that how is it that in when was it 2014? How is it that we're at that point where we can't even think of something more intelligent than just beep when it goes through a threshold? That's a design flaw for me. Another application, I think, of AI and machine learning in that area, although I say as a parent, probably a risky one. You have to get that one really right. Alarm when it's actually only useful to know.
Yeah, to your point, really, when you talk about risk, it's more complicated, because it's is the risk, well, it can never be wrong, or is the risk it can only be wrong less frequently or less importantly than when versus a human.
Yeah.
And I think the same arguments made about self-driving cars. Can they have 0 accidents, or are they allowed to have accidents but far, far fewer than humans would have? Is that okay?
Have you heard of the Daily Mail test?
I have not.
Okay, I suppose it's a British thing because the Daily Mail is a British newspaper. But Daily Mail, popularly known as a very accurate newspaper in the UK, a little bit, right wing, a little bit anti-immigration, blah 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 blah, and they often print stuff that gets people into trouble, especially politicians of all sides. And so we say, does this pass the Daily Mail test? And self-driving cars is probably one of them, right? Does it pass the Daily Mail test? Is it that you can have a car that is statistically much better than a human at avoiding accidents, but when it's that one accident that happens, that will blow up in the media, will blow up. And you could effectively kill off an innovation because of one incident, even though the truth is that it's statistically better. And I think that's more of a societal thing for us, that we have to adhere to a little bit more to the truth and actual fact rather than anecdotal evidence. That's basically the Daily Mail test. Does it pass it? Yeah.
We've talked a lot about design today, Manny, and we like to end the podcast the same way with everyone and ask them about design that they encounter in their everyday lives. So what are 2 or 3 things, and they can be outside of healthcare, but 2 or 3 things that are so well designed that they bring you joy to interact with?
Right. I'm gonna be a little bit geeky and a little bit esoteric for the 2 that I can think of. So the first one is one that I'm pretty sure no one who's listening has ever interacted with, but I used to interact with every day of my life. It was actually a programming language called Q. And it was, this is not, it's not design in the traditional sense of that you don't see, something nice and pretty on the screen. In fact, if you've never been trained in it, it looks absolutely awful, and you'll feel like blowing your brains out when you're trying to read it. But it is such a well-designed language, designed to do exactly what it's supposed to be doing: fast computation, vector mathematics, or vector logic, I should say, and in ways that are fully functional. So they, you could. It was funny. It was a relatively small community, let's say, because it's a relatively niche language, and there was an internal competition. I say internal, but global, of which there was probably only 100 people. But there was a competition of who could write the shortest Sudoku solver in the language, and someone got to 37 characters. And that's how amazing this language is that you can write an entire Sudoku solver, a program, in 37 characters. That is awesome programmatic design. It's not the type of design you guys are used to, so I'm cheating a little bit. But for a programmer, that was an absolute delight, a language to work with, that you can do such amazing things. That was really geeky, I'm sorry.
I love that. I love that.
The second one, I only have two, but the second one is also a bit of cheating. Again, not human-made design. I'm going to say design of ant colony behavior. Stick with me on this one. It does go somewhere. Just think about it. You see ant colonies all the time, right? They're all over your kitchen, and you kill them all, and it's like you never really think about what's actually happening under the hood. Ants have maybe 3, 4, 5, depending on the species, different types of ants inside that colony. Actually, each ant only really interacts with its environment. It doesn't know what's happening, miles away. It can only detect the chemical signals in its immediate vicinity or what's in the air. And therefore, it only operates on a very small set of rules. So if you were to computerize this, you could say you're going to have a very small set of rules with a very limited sense of very limited set of sense organs, if you like, sense of smell, essentially. And from that, you can create something so organized as a colony where it builds ventilation systems, it builds defense mechanisms. It even puts a graveyard on one side, on diametrically opposite sides of where it actually puts its food, where it harvests it. It always puts the queen and its eggs somewhere in the center, somewhere down below where it's nice and cool at a very precise temperature. All of these things come out because there are millions of agents that are interacting with a very limited set of rules. That is really interesting for me, because if you think about it, you could create very complex systems in machines, in computers, in software, by understanding how to create those rules. That design that nature has there, I think that just blows me away. That nature was able to come up. I say able to come up, you know what I mean. Evolved to create a design that was that beautiful.
You're making me tear up in talking about the Q programming language and ant colonies.
I'm going to make you cry even more now. Look, Liverpool.
Oh, wow. Wow. We really wanted to get through this episode without any English football references, but we were unable to do so. And for the record, I acknowledge that the team that you support, Liverpool Football Club, is slightly better than the team I support, Tottenham Hotspur. And that's on tape now, and that will never go away.
Thank you.
And but it will change next in the fall when we start playing again.
Let's see.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Mani Patel, for joining us and talking about healthcare and AI and design. We really appreciated it.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. For more information about Jiva, head to jiva.ai. That's JIVA.ai.
Check back for more episodes of Designing for Health wherever you listen to podcasts or on NordicGlobal.com. Till next time, we'll see you in network. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review. This helps others find the podcast as well.